Thank you to our generous sponsor, Lavender. Lavender is an online psychiatry and therapy office brought together by two nurses on a mission to help increase access to mental health care. Their group of psychiatric nurse practitioners is creating a space where feelings are felt, respected, and cared for. Learn more at joinlavender.com. Welcome, Season Sixers. As always, thank you for being part of our Color of Success podcast family. I'm your favorite host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Keep your eyes peeled for my brand new book coming out. It's called Cancel the Filter, where I share my experiences in the realm of mental health, both professionally and personally. Subscribe to colorsuccesspodcast.com to be on our waiting list. Seats are limited and being filled as we speak. We're also streaming on all your favorite platforms and socials. Whether you're on the go or comfy on the couch, you can tune in at your own comfort. As you know, we love growing discussions with our guests from our AAPI and minority communities. With so many friends and experts from different aspects of life, we love learning their stories and understanding what their success means to them. Let's get into it. Dr. Judith Joseph is a board-certified psychiatrist. Dr. Judith is chair of the Women in Medicine Initiative for Columbia University, Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. Dr. Judith is a clinical assistant professor of child and adolescent psychiatry at NYU Langone Medical Center. She recently received a congressional proclamation from the U.S. House of Representatives for her social media advocacy and research in mental health. Her behavioral research lab, Manhattan Behavioral Medicine, is conducting the first study in the world on high-functioning depression. She studies conditions related to pediatric and adult mental health. Dr. Joseph is an expert on various media platforms and has made national television appearances on Oprah Daily's The Life You Want series, Good Morning America, The Today Show, and CBS News. She is a medical consultant for Apple TV, where she was in the writer's room for the Crowded Room series. She recently received a 2020 Share Care Digital Emmy Award for her Med Circle series on PTSD and was nominated for 2 additional Share Care Digital Emmy Awards in 2023. Dr. Judith teaches medical media courses to physicians and medical students at Columbia University and NYU. Dr. Joseph, thank you so much for joining me today. Like I mentioned, I admire you so much, and thank you so much for signing in your scrubs from the East Coast. This is going to be a great conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're talking all about borderline personality disorder. More and more is known about anxiety and depression, and you are an expert in high-functioning depression. And I put that in quotes because there's like a silent suffering there. But less is known about BPD, or borderline personality disorder. So I'm wondering if we can touch upon both. Maybe let's start with high-functioning depression and then kind of transition into BPD as it co-occurs.
So both of them are not very well understood by most people. And I think that really TikTok and social media has driven interest. And a lot of times in medicine, we're behind. We don't know what our patients are, basically most people are really concerned about until it becomes an epidemic and until they start to demand. So I think that social media has really empowered everyone to have a voice. And high-functioning depression is something that I became interested in because I have a regular practice where I treat patients in therapy with medication. And then I have a research practice where I have a lab. That's why I wear scrubs. And I have a lab in Midtown Manhattan where I work with different companies to develop treatments. Some of them are pharmaceutical treatments for conditions like depression, anxiety, borderline personality disorder, ADHD, schizophrenia, because we need different treatments because everyone's body is different. Not everyone responds the same way to certain treatments. So we just need options, and we need evidence-based options. So my clinical studies are overseen by the FDA. Very different than like academic literature where you do your own like grants and then you get funding and then you get published. Industry studies lead to potentially treatments that can help billions of people. And that's what drew me to it. Rather than the prestige of getting published and having your name, I really wanted to help a lot of people. And that's why I do social media. You know, you can do one reel and 20,000 people are changed, but then you see one patient, and in that one session, one person's changed. So high functioning depression is something that I've seen in my research practice, because when you interview people to enter depression studies, according to the DSM-5, you have to have these criteria that are met, and it has to cause significant functioning issues or significant distress. But not everyone who has these symptoms will say that I'm having impairment in my functioning. In fact, a lot of them are saying, I'm actually killing it. You know, I'm actually doing well. And then not everyone is so in tune to their emotional, feelings to say that, oh, I'm having significant distress. Most people will say, no, like, what do you mean by that? I don't know if that fits, for me. And that's where we have these issues in research where people don't fit in neatly into a box.
Absolutely.
So if they don't fit neatly into a box, then they're not included in the box. And then you have a whole bunch of people that are not getting addressed, right? So I was seeing this type of phenotype where people were having these symptoms of depression, but not identifying as feeling depressed and not identifying as having significant impairment in function, but they were actually thriving, but there was something off. And I said, okay, let me make a reel about what I'm seeing in these patients and see if, like, maybe, I don't know, 100 people say, oh yeah, that's me. The opposite happened. It was more like, a 5 million viral video, right? And I was just like, oh wow, that went viral. Like, high function depression. I didn't even think about, okay, well, maybe it was because I paired it with this famous song, and maybe it was because the song went viral. But then I was like, let me do another one. And again, like, reel after reel, they were going viral. So I was like, there's something about this, like, high functioning depression is something people are identifying with.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if, there's a reason that it's not showing up in medical literature. And I started looking at, there was an article in the Washington Post where psychiatrists were saying, like, oh, it's not a real condition, and it's minimizing how serious depression is. And I was just like, really? Like,
there's a
I don't think
spectrum.
so.
Yeah, there's a spectrum, and I think people are kind of identifying it as burnout. And I was just thinking, like, they are in high functioning jobs, they are parents, they're kind of expected to do it all. And there is this level of stress and anxiety and depression that may go along with that.
Yeah, it's different than burnout, because burnout was only added to the WHO nomenclature very recently. And burnout has, this exhaustion and this distress associated with, and this lack of functioning, lack of zeal. Whereas a lot of the high functioning patients I treat, they're actually the top of their game, right? They look passionate. They're like, go, 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 go. And I think it's more of a combination of hustle culture,
Yes.
and our culture or our society as a whole not encouraging people to process their trauma. And then instead of dealing with trauma, you just push through it. Like, oh, this bad thing happened, like this pandemic happened, but we don't really process it. There's no memorial. There's no COVID-19 memorial where we get together and say, these are the lives that were lost and this is how it impacted us. It's like, okay, that's over. Let's just get through it and go on to the next, And so I think that what we're experiencing in this mental health crisis is this lack of processing trauma appropriately, and a combination of pushing through, like not acknowledging, not reflecting, not processing it together, but just instead busying ourselves with other things. So we busy ourselves with social media, we busy ourselves with work, we busy ourselves with consuming things, and that could be consuming alcohol in excess, which we know is happening now, especially in older adults. Our children are consuming social media at rates that are harmful for their developing brains. We don't even understand how it's going to impact their brains until it's already, harmed them. So there are ways that we as a society are not processing these traumas that are happening to us, and along the line, eventually it's going to catch up. And I think we're starting to see that already. We're starting to see CDC reports that young girls are experiencing suicidality at high rates, especially minority girls who were thought to have this protective element to them. We know now that that's not true. Mm-hmm. So it will catch up to us. And I think that we do need to provide more empathy in terms of validating what people are experiencing, that if they say that they have high function depression, believe them. There's something that they're experiencing that we don't have a category for yet in our medical research or in our medical text or in our insurance coding, but there's something there.
What does that look like though? Because I mean, we're talking about, again, maybe a lot of people that aren't fitting into this category, because a lot of people think when you're depressed, you're like staying in bed, you're not, you're maybe crying a lot. And I mean, obviously we're not minimizing, diagnostic standard major depressive disorder, but or what are you seeing in your practice manifest in patients that are kind of reporting this?
I think that the reason, and this may be controversial, I think one of the reasons we're not acknowledging it in medicine is because a lot of our doctors have high functioning depression. I think that
Yeah,
I'm not even
no,
joking.
I'm there with you. I mean, I definitely see people go in and are so type A, and that's another category. And
The way
again,
you just laughed, by the way.
yeah, right.
You're absolutely right, though. Yeah,
Yeah,
the type A.
yeah,
And I think for doctors, it's hard for them to pathologize something that they see in themselves. It's always the other. And that's where the ego comes in. It's like, well, I'm your doctor, listen to me. Like, that Meghan Trainor song. It's like, I know better and you're this and I'm that. And I think that in medicine, doctors, they don't, there's no culture of processing your trauma. Like I remember when I was a medical intern in my first month, I was on call and I was doing CPR on someone who passed away, and no one ever pulled me aside and said, "Oh, let's talk about that." Like, that must have been difficult for you. It was like, "Okay, are you taking this shift next week? Can I switch shifts?" It's like, wait, someone just like literally died, right? But in that culture, you know, it's their way of coping with it. You compartmentalize, you suppress, you don't deal with it, and you move on. So when you see a patient like you who's high powered, who's educated, who has a good family, who is generally healthy, but they're having anhedonia, like things in life don't give them satisfaction, they feel empty. You're not like, oh, like, let's create a treatment plan for you. It's like, well, you're one of the easy ones. Get out the door. I want to go and treat the person who has a lack of functioning because I can bill for that. So I think that that's why it's not addressed. And I think that in some other cultures in other countries, they're starting to shift that approach. Cultures that are more spiritual and philosophical and who intertwine that type of like, oh, meaning in life is really important. Like purpose is really important.
existentialism.
Correct. And I think that certain subcultures in other parts of the world are elevating that and saying, no, we are in a state of like philosophical famine. We're not feeling fed. And as a result of that, we're going out and we're drinking too much. We're getting high. We're binging on, media. We're doing all of these things that are eventually hurting our physical health. And so these other cultures, when I speak to doctors from other countries who are practicing in this more spiritualistic, holistic way, they're trying to feed the souls and the spirituality of their patients because they understand that has an effect on their bodies and health outcomes.
Right. Well, let's go back to the doctor piece. Yes, I laughed, and at the same time, there's this separation, like you said, the compartmentalization, and there is this idea that if they talk about some of the struggles that they're going through, that they would be seen as less competent, that they can't treat someone else if they're not functioning at a certain level. So, what are some recommendations that you see? And again, this is a work in progress for providers to really feel comfortable because in hospitals we have to do credentialing, we have to even have a certified letter saying, hey, there's nothing that's impacting our ability to provide care. So we're also talking about our livelihoods and our careers. I mean, how do we address that piece?
I think we have to treat ourselves first. I feel like we have to put the oxygen mask on first. If we are not living lives where we feel purposeful, where we're really investing our time into the people that matter the most, like our children, our partners, our friendships, our colleagues, if we are not practicing what we preach, then we're not going to have the effect, the impact with our patients. And I truly do believe that, because I think that when you feel full and fed as a provider, you're going to be more, I think your intent is going to be up when you see a patient who has all of the check boxes filled, but is not full, right? I think you're going to notice that, oh, like my patient just doesn't seem, that satisfied. Like there's something off. You're going to pick up on it. But if we're so busy and we're not, paying attention to our spiritual, emotional, mental health, then we're not going to see when someone else is lacking it, right? And I truly do believe that. That's why therapists are so different, psychiatrists are so different than other medical doctors, because we pick up on how we're feeling in the moment. When we're with a patient, we're thinking transference, countertransference.
I was
We're
just
thinking,
gonna say that.
yeah, we're constantly searching within ourselves. And I think if that was taught throughout all of medical specialties, like pick up on how your patient's feeling, learn about how it's impacting you, unpack what's happening in your psyche, I think that we'd be better connected to our patients. We'd have better outcomes. We wouldn't have these problems with misdiagnoses as much. Our patients would be more invested in the treatment. They'd be more active part of the treatment plan because they feel like you care. But healthcare, and again, capitalism has it set up that we don't have that time. We're not allowed to make that time. So we have to be creative. And I'm sure you've been in with a GP or a primary specialist who figured out a way to make an impact in 15 minutes. Some people are just skilled at that because they want to, and others are like, I got 15 minutes to do this and I'm out.
Yeah.
So it's not impossible. It's challenging. It takes more work, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, and I want to share an experience that I had in Korea. I went to a provider who did acupuncture, chiropractic medicine, as well as cupping. And he told me things about migraines that I've never heard in the States about just my specific body. And I think that that is so important to be able to have this diversity of experiences so you have second opinions. Now, everyone doesn't have access to that. And I only had one session and I was like, dang, I wish I was staying longer so I can see the impact of, long-term treatment. But what you're speaking to is really learning and being open to different doctors' approaches and figuring out ways to be super effective. Because in that, hour session, and Korea was so different. It's like I got an appointment the day I called. Yeah, I waited 15 to 20 minutes because he had other patients scheduled, but that is amazing. And I paid $80. I obviously don't have insurance in Korea, and just that level of care was amazing. And so, I really think about what you said, the idea and the way that the system is set up about capitalism and trying to make the highest dollar, and insurance companies paying providers crap. So they don't really want to do that, right? It creates inequities. That's a whole nother topic we could probably do a whole live on, but there is that structure there, and there are countries and providers that get it.
That's absolutely right. I'm so glad you said that, because I just did an interview with Forbes yesterday, a journalist at Forbes, and I was telling her that, like, listen, the amount of doctors and therapists we're going to have to produce to meet the mental health crisis, we'll be waiting for hundreds of years, right? So we've got to think outside of the box. We have to think differently. We can't do things the same. We need to utilize things like Eastern medicine, acupuncture, physical therapy, even, things like that, because we don't have the mental health therapists out there. We just don't have the availability, or people don't have the resources to pay for them, or insurances won't cover them. All those changes take time. And things like utilizing different types of therapy modalities that are not traditional in the Western sense is still a form of therapy, because you're feeling heard. Someone is validating your pain, even if it's physical pain. A lot of times these practitioners link the physical and the mental. There's a lot of mind-body talk in these sessions. And not everyone wants to do talk therapy. Not everyone's ready for that. People have a fear of it, and their fears are valid. So they have to take baby steps, and things like, utilizing the workplace. I talk about when I was on inpatient, the therapeutic milieu. We had to write that in our notes. And the workplace needs to feel like a therapeutic milieu because adults spend the majority of their time in the workplace. And so many adults have so many obligations. They have to take care of errands after work. They have to take care of their family members after work. So they don't want another additional step to, okay, now I got to go see a therapist or got to make an appointment online. So we have to meet them where they are in the workplace. We have to offer these type of trainings within the workplace setting so that the entire culture of the workplace supports the individual. And the same for schools, like students they're burnt out, then they have to come home and do homework, then they have to do chores. Some of our students are taking care of their younger siblings or helping their parents or have jobs. And then we want to like add therapy onto them. Well, it's not possible. So we have to meet them in the school system. So the schools have to be therapeutic. So there are different ways to addressing this mental health crisis beyond therapy, because not everyone realistically is going to be able to utilize therapy.
Yeah, and what you're really talking about is integrative health or whole health. And that has been a push in different hospitals, the one that I work at for sure. And it takes people's buy-in, not only the providers, but the patients as well. Like unfortunately, there's some marketing involved, right? It's like, we're not just going to assign you to a mental health provider. Let's talk with your whole team and kind of staff a person to have a unique individual approach. Now, again, what we're talking about is larger scale things. And that's has different opinions, right? You and I are in the media, we put out a lot of content, and sometimes it is more personal. One thing that I really resonated with is when you were a resident, having to deal with preferential treatment by nurses, you being at, getting the brunt of, I would say, I would call it out, discrimination, and not being attended to or taken care of in the same way that other residents may have been respected. And so those things are really important to look at as well, of like, wow, like how can we support providers that are from underrepresented groups so that we get equal treatment as well? But we're also talking about a larger scale thing where some providers are like, oh gosh, you're putting yourself out on TikTok or, Instagram or whatnot. And we get our fair share of haters. And so I also want to address that. It's like one of the clips that we just posted, we had, and I'm going to call it out, people were like, go back to China. And, the guest has had to deal with this. She's very well seasoned and someone that paved the way for us in media since 2015 for Asian podcasters. And people, the hate is just coming out. And like, this is the reason why we're posting this. But how do we address kind of, even I would call it stigma around providers, because this is impacting a lot of people, not just one person in our therapy office.
Yeah, I'm sorry that she dealt with that, and I wish that it was a rare occasion, but it's
Yes.
not. I think that when people are brave enough to put themselves out there on social media, there's a little bit of haterade. Like people are like, oh, so there's a doctor and like, they're on social media, and there's just like, there's a difference between jealousy and envy. Jealousy is, oh, I want what you have. Envy is, I want what you have, but I don't want you to have it. And unfortunately that happens. And I like, even when you're doing things not related to you. So like when I put out content about supporting our LGBTQ plus youth, I get a lot of hate, and it's just like, wow, people will go the next step. They'll complain about your account to Instagram. They'll get you flagged, and like you're just like, oh, what's happening here? But I think that being on social media and people spending a lot of their time on social media has led them to view humans as objects, inanimate objects. And
True.
they wouldn't say that to your face, right?
Oh, I
Because
know.
they would see you as a caring individual. So I think that, there is a dehumanizing element to the platforms, but at the same time, it is eye-opening, and it's a harsh reminder that racism is still very prominent, that it never left,
No.
that people now feel safe in the confines of their own home to attack people because they know there's no repercussion. They know that they can just close their account down and reopen another one, you know? So there's no accountability. And I really do challenge the billionaires behind these apps to really, step it up, because if they can do all the wonderful things they're doing with AI and no,
Yeah,
I'm
can we,
serious.
no, I'm with you. I'm like, come on, like let's scan these things for hate
Yeah,
comments and get on board. And it's like, and then there's a whole thing about free speech and stuff. And I'm like,
exactly.
there also needs to be some
Yes.
etiquette. I'm not saying like people can't give opinions, but when it becomes like things like that, it's not productive at all.
And it does have implications. It's not like, oh, it's just an opinion. Words hurt, and we're human beings. They get physiologically bothered when they're rejected. When people say hateful things, it actually hurts your physical and mental health. So, and think about the followers who have been through this type of racial trauma, and then they see this. It's just like it's not without any repercussions for the person being hurt and the people being hurt. So there should be repercussions for those who are doing this. I know that they have a way that they can, if they really want to, put an end to this. Figure out the IP addresses, block that person from joining the
Yes.
platform. But they won't do it, and that's a problem. And I know that a lot of platforms are being put under pressure for the way that children are being victimized and targeted,
Absolutely.
because they have the power to shut this down. So shut it down.
It's
So
really
there needs
sad
to
to
be
me.
accountability.
In middle school, my daughter had orientation with the police, and they were giving the number of how many people committed suicide because of cyberbullying. And I'm like, if we know that this is an issue, and it's scary as a parent, and we'll talk more on the live, but it's scary as a parent to know that it's not only physical bullying and emotional bullying in person. Now we have to deal with, people posting some very personal videos because they took out their phone. I mean, I just hear horror stories, right? Of like, especially when they start becoming tweens or teenagers, about, posting things of a sexual nature. And there's that sexual assault piece that's not really being acknowledged, of like, no, that's traumatizing and people should be held accountable for doing that to people.
Well, I mean, that CDC data that came out about girls being targeted, I think it was like 1 in 10 or 1 in 7, something really astounding. Teen girls reporting that they were sexually assaulted. It's just like, what's happening in this world today? We need to put an end to this. I said this on a television show recently, when the CDC data came out, and they were like, what do you think of the state of mental health in youth? And I was just like, the sexual assault, da, da, da. And the guy was like, whoa, he wasn't expecting that. And I was like, this is a crisis. We need to protect our girls. And he was just
Really?
like, oh, what about the depression, anxiety? I'm like, well, wouldn't you be depressed and anxious if you were being assaulted? Like
Yeah.
it's all tied. It's
Yeah.
all tied.
And you don't want to go to school because it's just like, really checking in with people and having consequences to the behavior, and going away from victim blaming. I think that's the huge thing. And I heard this recently. I don't know if you've heard about it, like victim envy people are throwing out. And I'm like, I don't know many victims that envy other victims. I'm sorry. Like, I don't, he's like, oh, there's a trend on that. And it's like, dude, no. I mean, just
Majority of
straight
victims won't
no.
even tell you. They won't even tell you. The victims do not want to talk about it. The symptom of PTSD is shame and internalized blame. And, a lot of the times your brain blocks it out because you don't even want to talk about it. So I don't know where they got that idea from, but most people who've gone through those terrible experiences, they don't want to talk about it. They're not saying like, I'm a victim, da, da, da. Like they want to hide it.
Or the idea of like you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps, using an old school phrase, and just get over it and be able to work hard and push against racial trauma. And it's like, that is not an intervention to be able to process it. I this has gone in a really great direction. You also do research. I don't know how you do all this, but you also do research on borderline personality disorder, the psychopharmacology aspect. But the media in terms of BPD, what I can think of is Girl Interrupted, and these youngsters do not know that movie. And so I'm wondering if you can, one, talk about what is a personality disorder, and specifically, what do we see with BPD?
Well, Girl Interrupted, interestingly, was a book that I read as a part of my psychiatry curriculum at Columbia. And it's based on a true story of the author. She was hospitalized at McLean, which at the time I think still is one of the leading hospital systems for borderline personality disorder. And the reason that I started doing social media reels on it was because my patients who are coming into the studies were saying that there wasn't a lot of information out there.
No.
And they felt that if a doctor saw that diagnosis on their chart, that they wouldn't be able to find a therapist, that they get treated differently, that, when they're hospitalized, nurses will say, oh, we got another one, like another borderline. So they were saying that one of the things that could be done was decreasing the stigma. So I started doing TikTok reels on borderline. And again, and those went viral. And like, I try to use humor, and I try to for any of the reels, educate, but also using humor in a way that's respectful. And initially, when you put yourself out there, you're like, oh, I hope anyone isn't offended.
Offended,
But
yeah.
it's the opposite. You don't want people to be offended because, BPD has such negative stigma associated with it. I didn't want to add to that. And sometimes I'll get one or two people who say, this is offensive, but the majority of people will jump in and be like, no, she's not offensive. This is me. And like, maybe it's not your experience, but leave the doctor alone. I'm like, thank you,
Yeah.
So like, speaking of bullying online, if you feel powerless, defend the doctors, right? Like go after these trolls, But so I started to put out just simple information about the symptomatology, explaining. I think one of the key differences was a lot of my patients were coming in with all these bipolar disorder medications, and they were having all these side effects and they weren't getting better. And so what I explained to them was that, borderline personality disorder is a pervasive pattern of how you behave in relationships and also how you feel emotionally. And yes, triggers on the outside worsen it, but it's primarily there at all times, right? Whereas bipolar disorder, is characterized as having, depending on, bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, but you have these manic or hypomanic episodes, mood episodes that are very, very clear and distinct from your baseline. So
Right.
I explained it as, okay, think about bipolar as like, all right, this is your baseline, and then you have a manic episode, then you have a depressed episode, and I draw this line of like up and then down below your baseline. And then I say, but think about borderline personality disorder as it's like you're kind of always there. You're teeter-tottering right there. And some things will make it worse, but your baseline is the personality traits, the way you interact with others, the way that you deal with your emotions. And I think that helps because, the difference is that you'll have these clear-cut episodes with mania and hypomania where you have these interruptions in sleep that you have a decreased need for sleep. You may
Impulsive behavior.
right. And people in your life will say, this is a clear change from who you are, versus with borderline personality disorder, there's no clear change from who you are. This is who you are, right? And it's not as extreme, as with bipolar disorder. So like, this is who you are, things trigger it, but this is for the most part who you are, until you get into treatment. There are also different genetics involved. So with bipolar disorder, there's a high genetic correlation, much higher than with borderline personality disorder. With borderline personality disorder, you see clear things in childhood, typically neglect, abuse, parents who are narcissistic, parents who are themselves have borderline traits. Whereas with bipolar disorder, you're going to look for a family history of mania and hypomania. But people with borderline personality disorder, in my clinical studies, I'll use something called the ZAN-BPD. It's the Zanarini borderline personality rating scale, and it was made at McLean Hospital, but it's used in all clinical research for borderline personality disorder. And we look at things like, do you feel empty? There are 9 criteria in the DSM-5. You have to meet 5 of 9 for a consistent, amount of time. It has to be consistently throughout your life. So we'll ask things like, do you feel empty? And then we go even further, because like we all feel a little empty sometimes, it depends on your definition of empty, right? That's why I advise people not to diagnose themselves based on looking up the DSM and then doing that, because the provider will go more in depth with you.
Thank you. Yes.
So when I go through ranges of emptiness, it goes from like 0 to 3. So we'll talk about like feeling hollow inside, feeling like there's a void in you. Like there are variations of emptiness, right? We'll ask things like, do you have an unclear sense of self? And we'll take it a step further. Are you shifting in how you basically perceive? Do you go through periods where like sometimes you identify as X and then not as X, maybe as Y? And this is different than gender fluidity. This is very different. And so at times people will go through like different job changes that are a bit drastic. Like they'll say, oh, I want to go to medical school, but then they'll drop out. Or I want to go to law school, like very extreme things. You'll ask about rage. And this is where I think, borderline can look like bipolar, because both can have these irritable outbursts. So like, yeah, so the rage can be pretty intense. There's one of the symptomatology is paranoia. So it's not like true psychosis that you would see in schizophrenia. It's more like, thinking that people are against you for some reason and having these beliefs that, that aren't really happening, that, somehow people are out to get you. And also within that kind of like the paranoid thing is dissociations. A lot of times people with borderline personality disorder will say, sometimes I don't even feel like I'm attached to myself when they're in a particularly paranoid state. Interpersonal relationships, are your relationships having, ups and downs? Are you frequently in these tumultuous relationships? Do you do things like risk-taking behaviors? Are you, spending a lot, eating a lot, binging, having sexual indiscretions that are regretful, using substances? And a lot of these patients will come in on stimulants because it looks like ADHD. This is the really important thing. It's this fear of perceived abandonment. And it has to be more than like, everyone has a fear of abandonment. I want to be loved. It's very different, because the fear of abandonment drives a lot of the behaviors. The fear of abandonment is a true fear where people feel like even with the most innocuous, harmless behavior, they will be dropped. And it's thought that this is rooted in poor attachment early on, where they had either depressed or neglectful or abusive attachment figures, where the child just didn't know where they stood. And that created this inner anxiety that has never resolved. And so the fear of abandonment is very palpable, and it drives a lot of the behaviors. And it's very distressful. It's very distressful to the individual. They'll do things like, texting at all hours of the night, showing up randomly at their partner's homes, acting out or retreating, like the opposite, what you would think like, I don't want to be abandoned, so I'm going to abandon you. So things like that. So, you have to meet 5 of 9 of these criteria. I want to make sure I mentioned all of them. But typically it's stable over time. You're seeing this over time. It's not like I have a year without borderline symptoms and I'm back to who I am. That's more of what you see with bipolar disorder. You'll have a year without a manic or depressive episode where your baseline mood, and then it comes back.
Yeah.
Borderline personality disorder is consistent. And in many ways, I'll say, in some ways, it's probably more ideal for some people to be diagnosed with borderline versus bipolar, because borderline personality disorder has really good treatments that are therapies. Dialectical behavioral therapy is a treatment modality that was invented by someone who identifies as being having borderline personality disorder, and it's evidence-based, and it works. And so we know that, just because you're diagnosed with having borderline personality disorder doesn't mean that you won't be able to cope with it. And I have had so much success with patients being treated in dialectical behavioral skills groups. So typically what happens in a true DBT, you're with an individual provider and a group. A lot of institutions will say it's not DBT if you're not doing skills groups, it doesn't work without that interpersonal type of treatment.
Mm-hmm.
So they want you to work in skills and complete modules together. And some of the programs that I refer my patients to will have a 24/7 line, because instead of being impulsive and going out and drinking and having sex with people that you don't want to have sex with, and doing things that you regret, or instead of calling your favorite person and dialing them up and doing things impulsively, there's a 24/7 line. You call your therapist, So these type of treatments are built to really ensure the most success for the client, and show them that, listen, you can control this. You don't have to just live with something. You can master skills to help you cope with it. So in many ways, having a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder is more ideal for some than bipolar disorder, because the treatment really for bipolar disorder are things like, medications, mood stabilizers, like, Depakote lithium, antipsychotics, ECT, things like that, versus which you sometimes have to like revisit again. Sometimes the medication stops working, sometimes they cause side effects and so forth. So in many ways, you like, it can be more ideal, right? The other way, the opposite way of looking at that is that, at least with, when you have bipolar disorder, you have periods of mood stability, like there are these respites, ideally, and someone who's not like a severe like rapid cycler, but you have these periods at least where you have a stable mood.
Let's talk about the relationship piece. And DBT is amazing because the person that created it was a doctor and struggling with these very symptoms. And we're really talking about emotion regulation, keeping yourself safe so you're not self-harming or doing these impulsive behaviors. But let's talk about the relationship or the interpersonal aspect, because in a psychodynamic sense, patients split. They focus on one person because, again, they have a fear of abandonment, and the person becomes a bad object or a good object. And so you see this split where, like you talked about the rage, there's a rage there when someone becomes a bad object, and can be uncomfortable for the provider when they become the bad object. But more importantly, in their lives, if they are keeping a relationship, and there's that stigma too of like, oh, people with BPD don't have long-term relationships. That's not necessarily true, because they attach to one person, and depending on how that person responds to some of these symptoms, they can stay in a relationship and not be abandoned, but there's maladaptive behaviors to keep that person, right? So what does that look like, with the rage, with latching onto a person? And really the idea of personality disorders is it's everyone's fault. It's not my fault. That's the crux of most personality disorders. So how do people kind of recognize it and have an aha moment that it's not the other person? There's something going on there.
I'm glad you brought that up, because you're talking about primitive defense mechanisms versus like higher level ones.
Mm-hmm.
And splitting is one that I did a reel on recently, and I was surprised at how well it did, because I thought, oh, splitting, something we use in everyday psychiatry talk. But really seeing someone as all bad or all good is not a healthy way to approach individuals. We all have ideal qualities and less ideal qualities. And, the argument for a DBT treatment not being true DBT without a group is really important. It's really important to have multiple providers, because you will see some of these themes playing out between the patient and the group, the patient and the providers, where, I had a couple of years ago, someone in DBT where they had their favorite therapist in the group, and then their therapist who hated them. And eventually during the treatment, that swapped. They started idealizing the therapist that they hated before, and then devaluing the therapist that they once loved. And the group was able to pull it together and show this person, look, what you're doing outside in your real life, you're doing it here in the therapy. It was an aha moment for this individual. They had no idea. And so it can be very empowering to enter skills group and learn about these psychological principles. And that's what I love about DBT, because it's very different than other type of therapies where it's like, okay, you do homework, you do this, you're a part of the process. You're learning about this. You become an expert alongside the experts. And it really allows you to validate how you're feeling, because a lot of times the emotional regulation is, it's overwhelming, and it's not like, oh, you're not feeling what you're feeling. Actually, what you're feeling is spot on. No one can take your feelings from you. Validate your emotions, and let's also think about ways to self-regulate that are more healthy. And so DBT will bring in Eastern philosophies like mindfulness, right? And you're starting to realize that there are certain things that I can do to ground myself, so that even though I'm feeling what I'm feeling, I can self-regulate so that my behaviors are more desirable. So I don't do things that I regret. So I don't do things that push people away, because I have a core fear of abandonment. Why would I want to do things to, push people away? Because abandonment freaks me out,
Yeah.
So it allows the person to see these patterns that they were not aware of before, and to actually make changes. And why, there's that saying, you could fish for a village, or you could teach them how to fish. I feel like DBT is a really good representation of that, because you're teaching skills that this person can draw on for the rest of their lives. And there are family DBTs, which I love, because while you technically cannot diagnose someone under 18 with having DBT, we know that these patterns start early in a
Yes.
child's life. So you'll start to see patterns in teen patients. I treat children and adults. So I'll see, I'm starting to see patterns that look like borderline personality disorder in this 15-year-old.
It's very
Let's try,
clear how,
yeah, it's
and
very
especially
clear.
when you know the parent
Yes.
in the treatment, you're like, oh, like this is a recipe for disaster that can be headed off and nipped in the bud. But when they're so young too, it's like they're not going to be like, oh, there's something wrong with me. And we see a lot of burnt bridges
Yes.
in folks, teenagers as well. It's like, oh, this person pissed me off,
Mhm.
so I'm not going to talk to them right now because I don't, like you said, I don't want to be abandoned. So I'm going to push this person out, and that person's no longer my friend.
Yeah. I think you're right about that. Like, you start to see this, like, these behaviors that really harm teenagers interpersonally. And we know that when a teen feels rejected, in their brain, the parts that light up when they're in physical pain, excruciating pain, when they get rejected, those are the parts of the brains that are lit up. So we know that this hurts. And we want to get ahead of that, because these teens, may cope with this in an impulsive way, such as like self-harm. And we want to
Yeah.
get ahead of that. So family DBT is very important, because the family practices the skills and remind the child of utilizing the skills at home. So that reinforces the treatment a step further. In many ways, I think that creates more chance of success, because you're getting it in the skills group, you're getting it with your therapist, and then you're also reinforcing it at home with your family. And the family, because it's an interpersonal dynamic, they're playing these out. So your brain is changing and learning with these real life situations.
Yeah, the group is, I can't emphasize the importance enough, because like you're bringing it back to that, is you're getting real in the moment feedback about your interpersonal style from, however many people are in the group, but also the providers. And that is so valuable, because you cannot get that in individual therapy. You don't have a whole bunch of people being like, ooh, that may not be the best way to go, to work on your treatment or practice the skill, etc. So I cannot I cannot emphasize enough how important that component is. And when we're thinking about individuals with BPD, there's aha moments in there, And I guess I wonder, how do we help people recognize that to even seek treatment? Because it's like we're seeing people that may be like, you know what, this is just a moment where I just had an outburst. And for us as providers, we see that it's a pattern. So, how do we, even as friends, as family members, kind of approach this topic where they're not like, well, I don't want to hear anything that you have to say?
With younger individuals, I try to use a more modern approach. I'll say like, let's look in your smartphone and let's look back at all the pictures over time, like your favorite pictures and experiences.
Mm,
You'll see that there are friends that got lost along the way. Like, oh, I cut this person off. Oh, we're not talking anymore. And it's like, let's collect the evidence, because it's like you're an archaeologist going back in time and dusting off history trail. Look at all the people you've left behind. How do you feel about that? And like I said, rejection and abandonment are very, very, very palpable affairs. So that sometimes is enough to motivate individuals to want to create change. The other thing is like with all of my patients, we at the beginning of the treatment, and then as we check in throughout the treatment, we revisit the treatment goals. So we always want to identify what the goals of the treatment are, and are you meeting those goals? So if you can align DBT with the treatment goals, then there's more buy-in.
mhm.
When you have someone who's being forced into therapy, it typically doesn't work. So what I would say is, use empathy. No one likes to be told that there's something wrong with them. But what you can do is, suggest, oh, would you listen to this podcast with me? Or will you watch this movie with me that has like similar themes? Or will you read this book with me? Or share them a meme or share them a reel? Like there are ways to have an intervention without being like, you need treatment. You need to be in therapy. Even if they do need it, no one likes to be told it that way.
So, where can people see your content, follow your research, and all that good stuff?
On my TikTok and my Instagram, Dr. Judith Joseph.
It's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, y'all, that's all the time we have today. Thank you, Dr. Joseph, for coming on the show today and sharing your expertise on high-functioning depression and borderline personality disorder. If you want to connect more with Dr. Joseph, head over to her TikTok and Instagram at Dr. Judith Joseph. Subscribe to colorsuccesspodcast.com, where we'll get you more exclusive contact with Dr. Joseph and how she can help you with high-functioning depression and borderline personality disorder. Also remember to book your seats for my brand new book coming out, Cancel the Filter, where I will be revealing to you all of the unspoken realities of how I've learned to navigate the challenges of my own mental health as a working mother, psychologist, and podcaster. All behind the scenes, all unfiltered. Seats are getting limited as we speak. Book now by October 17th at colorsuccesspodcast.com or emailing us at thecospodcast@gmail.com. In our next episode, we will be talking to Dr. Demetria McNeil, where we'll be unraveling the topic of boundaries and honing in on how to set them in relationships. So if you've ever come across difficulty with how to phrase boundaries or setting and maintaining boundaries, or this was ever something you've considered, this is definitely for you. So hit that like, subscribe, and follow button to stay updated on all social media and streaming platforms. May all be well with you. With gratitude, Stephanie.